Serve a great God. Grace, grace. I don't know about you, but since last week on my mind has been one of the lines in that song and thinking about urging individuals to respond to the grace. It requires of us something, and we think about the topics that we have before us. And if you weren't here last week, if by way of introduction we can reflect a little bit on that, it'll be, I think, good for us, important. Not that I would want anyone to have to suffer through listening to that lesson again, but at least if you would take Luke 15 to mind, if you would put that before your heart and before your mind and think about this is the God that we're talking about. The one, Luke 16, and we began and introduced the idea that our eternal destiny is discussed there. Heaven, hell, at least punishment, and reward. But before that, God reaches out and we see something beautiful about Him. We see that He doesn't desire anybody to go there. He desires all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. And so with those thoughts in mind and thinking about last week, what are we talking about? You know, as we stand maybe in line to get coffee, as we are driving down the freeway, as we are at maybe even family gatherings and holiday events, right? They're more than just moms and dads there. They're more than just grandparents there. There's more than friends and family. There's more than individuals just that get on our nerves and people that cut us off and individuals that can't make up their mind. They're when we stop and we pause for a moment and we think about God's creation and what He did, especially when He created you and me. There's souls there. There's a soul, and it's an humbling thought, and we stop and we pause for a moment that we'll have to face its maker. We'll have to stand before the God who created us. And it's a humbling thought, it's a sobering thought, and it's one, and it reminded me of a thought that Timothy Keller wrote about. He said, and I love the comment he made in his book, The King's Cross. It talks about our subject of last week. He states that all truly life-changing love, and if I could edit it, the real love, agape love, he says, is substitutionary sacrifice. All real love, that agape type love, love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength and your neighbor as yourself. That kind of love is substitutionary sacrifice, and I think He's right there with Christ. He's right there with God as He speaks. It costs you something. I wonder if we don't think about love and all it is because we really struggle practicing that type of love. I think, though, it's easy, at least for me in my mind as a parent. I know not all of you are parents, but we can think about it in terms of maybe our own parents if we don't have children ourselves. That it really costs us something to love those little things, right? Maybe sanity for some. It costs a lot of your time. It certainly costs a lot of your money. It costs so much, and then you can start to think about, well, who do I really love in this life? Who are the closest people to you? Who are the individuals that are closest to you or that you hang out about? That, hey, I love you. Is there any substitutionary sacrifice? You ever noticed how we like to hang around the people that look like us and act like us and do the things like us because it's easy? And it really doesn't take that much agape. It doesn't really take that much self-sacrifice to do that, to really love them. It's going to cost me something to reach out to you and have a relationship with you. And when I think about love in those terms, and I think about it, and that's how God loves, I can start to have a discussion about the topic of hell, about this place that God has created for the devil and his angels. I can start to think about it. And the first thing I like to consider, for each of us to consider, is that Jesus didn't try to change individuals' minds about hell. Without a doubt, the Jewish mind believed in hell. And in his book, Erasing Hell, the subtitle, What God Said About Eternity and What We Made Up, Francis Chan discusses that idea, and he makes beyond a shadow of a doubt a convincing argument that in the first century, the Jewish mind, like taking Daniel 12 and verse 12, would have believed that there was a place of eternal punishment, there was a place of eternal reward, that there was this eternity. And it's interesting, the things about Jesus. You know what Jesus did. If the Pharisees and the scribes and all these individuals had a belief about hell and it was wrong, what do you think Jesus would have done about it? What did he do about their belief about marriage and divorce? Matthew chapter 5, 31 and 32. What did he do about their belief about wealth? Luke 16, 17, and 18. Right? What did he do about their belief about their attitudes, about covetousness, about anger? He sharply rebuked them. You've got it all wrong. That is not what the God of heaven believes, and that's not what you need to believe. And yet when it comes to this discussion and this idea about hell, we have to look at Jesus. Would you turn with me for a moment? I'm going to ask you to flip and turn a little bit, a lot of different places today, because this topic I'm not so comfortable with discussing and talking about. May we be sure that these are the words of God. But would you think for a moment at some of these sobering passages about Jesus, the greatest expression of God's love, says about this place of eternal punishment? Maybe consider first Matthew chapter 25. Matthew chapter 25, verse 31 begins the section, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all his holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, verse 32, and he will separate them one from another as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those on his right, Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And we're familiar somewhat. For those who were hungry, he gave them food. He gave a drink. You gave a drink to those who were thirsty. But read a little further. The righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when do we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When do we see you naked? And then the king will answer, verse 40, and say to them, Surely I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. But then he'll also say to those on the left, Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire, prepared for the devil and his angels. That's Jesus. That's Jesus. He talks about something that a lot of us, I guess, we don't consider he talks about. Jesus not only talked about heaven, John chapter 14, I'm going to prepare a place for you. The reason he came is because he was saving us from that eternal torment, that horrible, dreadful place. There's going to be this separation. Jesus talks about it, Matthew chapter 25. Would you go to another place, though, back a little bit, Matthew chapter 5. Maybe you want to keep your finger there, though, in 23. We'll come back in a second. Matthew 5. Look for just a second. Matthew 5:22. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Whoever says to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says you fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. That's one of several occasions in this Sermon on the Mount when Jesus brings this idea of eternal punishment, hell, to the forefront of their minds and speaks of it as reality. The Jewish mind would have definitely believed and thought about a place of eternal punishment, and Jesus comes along, he enters the scene, and he doesn't rebuke them for this thought. He talks about it in real-time terms, that it exists. It's as real as the heaven that we all love to talk about and to think about, the one that Jesus came to build a ladder to. And I think that's an important part of this discussion. And I hope we would think about it and talk about it. There's other places that we could go. For time's sake, I won't. But would you read about the words of Jesus? He talks far more about hell. Did you think about that? Than he does heaven. Jesus, when he comes to earth, he thinks about this. And he's warning us in his love of that place. Was that hard for you to chew on? If I'm honest, I stand before you and I say that's hard for me to think about. can a God so loving, how can a God so full of grace, as we just sang about, possibly think about punishing people for eternity in hell? Bertrand Russell said, that's the one thing about Jesus that I don't understand. I can't understand that about that avid atheist. How could Jesus, there's one thing wrong with Jesus, that he believes in hell. Those caused C.S. Lewis to write, if there was one doctrine, if there was something that I could remove, as he was talking about evil, pain, and suffering, he said, it's the doctrine, it's the teaching of hell. And as I started this study, I felt the same way. If we could just get rid of that thought, oh, how Christianity would be so much more palatable. How our pews could be filled in. And yet as you start thinking about that and trying to make sense of this world and trying to make sense of God's revelation, I hope you'll follow me, and I want to share with you 5 things that helps me understand hell in light of God's love. 5 things to understand hell in light of God's love, because I began reading, and like I said, this was for me. I'm talking about 5 things, and maybe if you were going to do this lesson and you're going to give it, you could talk about a different 5, and maybe we could get the number all the way up to 1,000 as we thought about the ways that God has showed us and helped us to understand His love in light of hell. But I was reading Lee Strobel's book, A Case of Faith. And as he was writing this, is a skeptic's look at faith and all the questions that individuals ask. And he sat down with a PhD. And as he sat down with this PhD and they talked through the various arguments and the various problems that he had with the idea of hell, it helped me. As he began giving biblical answers and divine thought to these questions that struggle and they pull at our heartstrings, it helped me. And so in a similar way, I know I'm not a PhD, I know I'm not a great journalist and writer, but 5 ways when we look at these things is you encounter them, as you butt heads with these ideas, and see how maybe I've thought through them, but we're going to see what God thinks about these 5 things. How can we think about hell and have a healthy discussion about it in light of God's love? That's what I'll promise today, and I know that's not going to maybe convince anybody of its reality. It's not going to convince somebody who's standing on the other side, but would you at least start having a dialogue, at least start having a discussion, because Jesus did, and because if the heaven that he talks about is real, why isn't the hell he talks about real also? Consider for that, I guess that's one of the thoughts, and I'm getting into that too much on this difficult discussion, but as you think about these 5 things in light of God's love, the first thing is that Jesus believed in it. And you think, yeah, we just talked about that. Yeah, we just said that Jesus believed in it. Corey, how's that going to help me understand and begin to think about hell in light of God's love? And I think about Jesus. You know the man that Sam's been talking about for a few weeks now, as we're looking at the defenses of Christianity, as we're looking at its real time and how can logical, rational people believe in the God of Christianity. And one of the people that's asking that question and attacking us is Richard Dawkins. It was interesting. If you do a simple Google search and you look up, I don't know exactly, Richard Dawkins, Atheist for Jesus, you might find this picture that I found of him walking on the beach in a T-shirt that says, Atheist for Jesus. And I know he's probably making fun of, I don't know exactly the context, he's making fun of Christianity and he's putting holes in arguments, I guess, that individuals have, but it brought to my mind something. When you think about Jesus, when the world, they think about Jesus, what do you think about? People that love organized religion, people that hate organized religion. What causes atheists to put T-shirts on that say Atheist for Jesus? There's something so spectacular about this man. He's the greatest man that ever walked the earth, right? Jesus and all, he's just great. And because Jesus believed in hell, I start to understand it a little bit better. Think about this for a moment. In John chapter 1 and verse 1, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him. Without him, nothing was made that was made. Who is this Word and who is this Him? Verse 14 reveals to us, and the Word became flesh and He dwelt among us. We learn that it's Jesus Himself. And what Jesus came to do, verse 18, is to reveal God to us. Show us who God really is. And when He did it, right, the world has since fallen in love with it. What caused individuals over and over it took the world by storm? What would Jesus do? Bracelets, right? People who loved Christianity did not. The idea was spectacular. It was awesome. It reminds me of the song we sang this morning in Bible class. Right? Have you seen Jesus, my Lord? Oh, it's a great thought. I don't know. Do y'all sing this in the auditorium? Have you seen Jesus, my Lord? Yeah. I first heard it as a youth song, but it's a beautiful song. And have you ever stood at the ocean, right, with the white foam at your feet? If you have, then I say you've seen Jesus, my Lord, it says, right? Have you ever looked at the sunset? And that brilliant sunset and the red, I'm forgetting the words now. Have you ever stood in the family of God? Have you ever stood at the cross? And maybe if we make it a little more personal, did you ever hold your baby seconds after the breath of life came in? Did you ever see it and hear its first scream? Right? Did you ever sit and hold hands with somebody that you loved and view something just beautiful? Have you ever sat around the table with the matriarch or the patriarch of your family at a holiday perhaps, and you just see tears rolling down their face? Just tears of joy and, hey, that's my family. Happy because we're just together for a little while. Then I say you've seen Jesus, the creator of the world. He made us that way. He made us love those things. He made all that's great about this world and the goodness. And when I think about hell in light of God's love, I can start to believe in it because of Jesus. He creates what's good. I got that thought in reading that book I told you about a moment ago. And at the end of the discussion about hell, he introduces this thought, Lee Strobel. He said, when you're starting to create a friendship with someone that you don't understand everything about them, you don't necessarily agree with or even feel good about everything about all the views in which he holds, but you have to ask on balance, do you trust this person enough to want to enter a friendship with him? The same is true with Jesus. Every single issue isn't going to be resolved before we enter into a relationship with Him. But the question is, on balance, can you trust Him? Remember Nathaniel at the end of chapter 1 and John chapter 1? Have you ever read through the book of John? At the end of chapter 1, he looks and he sees Nathaniel sitting under the fig tree, but Nathaniel didn't know, and he said, you're the one sitting under the fig tree. And that was at that moment, and Nathaniel says, you are the Messiah. He says, Nathaniel, because I saw you sitting on the fig tree, you believe you're going to see much greater things. And it wasn't very long, as not long ago Sam was talking about, right? The water, it turned wine. If that man, he can turn water into wine, what do you think he could do with your life? And you don't have to wait very long. He starts to show you in John chapter 3, religious leaders, those Pharisees and the scribes who he's rebuking, and he has this really intimate personal relationship. He's giving them the full knowledge of God. John chapter 4 also, with the knowledge of God helping this woman come and understand a relationship before him. John chapter 5, not only through a knowledge, but through the miraculous power, confirming His word, confirming His authenticity as the Son of God. He's transforming people. He's giving them their health back, their sight back. He's feeding people. When you look through and you see the gospel accounts, this Jesus who's so great, who's so wonderful, who the world falls in love with the idea of Jesus, He believed in hell, a place of eternal punishment, and He came to save us from it. I can begin to understand and have a dialogue about hell in light of God's love because Jesus believed in it. But also as we think about this, and I don't know how that resonates with you, it still comes to mind and maybe segues into this one, and it could be under the same title, but there's some things I don't completely understand, and that's okay. There's some things I don't completely understand, and that's okay. Could you consider for a moment these different verses and things they speak of in terms of hell? The spiritual abode of the wicked is a state of pain, trouble, and sorrow, according to Psalm 116 and verse 3. It's characterized by shame and contempt, according to Daniel 2 and verse 2. It's a realm of affliction, according to Jonah 2 and verse 2. Hell's a place of outer darkness where there's weeping and the gnashing of teeth, Matthew 23 and verse 30. It's a sphere of eternal fire, according to the verses we read a moment ago, chapter 25, verse 41. It's a place where the worm, a figure of gnawing anguish, does not die, Mark 9 and verse 48. The wicked are described as being beaten with stripes there, Luke 12, 47 and 48. They're recipients of God's wrath and indignation. They experience tribulation and anguish, Romans 2, 8 and 9. They suffer punishment as a manifestation of the Lord's vengeance, 2 Thessalonians 1, 8 and 9. Hell is a place of utter torment where no rest is ever known, according to Revelation 14, 10 and 11. What thoughts resonate with you as you think about those different things? I'm going to share one with you for me, and yours is probably different, but how is it possible? How is hell a place of utter darkness and also a place of fire? How is it when we consider for a moment, and I don't know what that brings to mind for you, but one person put it this way: while it would not be an expression of responsible exegesis to literalize the figures of speech cataloged, the ones we just mentioned, one never must forget that the symbolism is designed to emphasize the absolute terror of being abandoned by God. Moreover, the figures doubtless do not do justice to the actual reality of this eternal nightmare. I've got question. What's it going to be like? The pain and the punishment and the torture, is it really fire? What is the punishment like? I've got question, but in light of God's love, and as I think about that Jesus believed in it, and because I still have doubts, it doesn't get rid of it. I can begin to understand it because He allows me to have them. I think about Nathaniel, and I think about Philip, I think about Andrew, others. You really found Messiah? Nothing good can come from Nazareth. Why don't you come and see? Why don't you come take a look? In the midst of your doubts, in the midst of your skepticism, come and look at Jesus, my Lord. Even in the midst of doubts and wondering and questions, can believe in the God of heaven. But as we move a little further, the third thing I've put and think about is I can understand, have a dialogue, a discussion, believe in hell in light of God's love because He's spiritual and He's objective. He's spiritual and He's objective. It's hard to talk about God that way in light of such a topic. Would you say that's true? What's the objection? And we come and we think about, I don't see how God could ever do that. I don't understand. I don't get how I could never do that to somebody. And when we begin to have a discussion about hell, somehow we remove the objectivity from it. We remove truth from it. We begin to rely upon our feelings and our emotions. And when I stop for a moment, and I know you can't remove it completely, but what if we stop for just a minute and tried to understand and pause for a moment and say, God's spiritual, He's objective. How is it that He thinks about this topic. And with that in mind, I want to read to you something. It's wrong to think of God as simply a loving being, especially if you mean loving in the sense that most Americans use it today. Yes, God is a compassionate being, but He's also a just, moral, and pure being. So God's decisions are not based on modern American sentimentalism. This is one of the reasons why people have never had a difficult time with the idea of hell until modern times. People today tend to care only for the softer virtues like love and tenderness, while they have forgotten the hard virtues of holiness, righteousness, and justice. What makes God so great and so full of love, and why Jesus is so special, is not only His compassion, His tenderness is the other side of the coin. His objective right and wrong, that He knows why do you call me good? There's one who's good. Getting that individual to think about, hey, if you're calling me good, you're calling me God. God is the only good, the source of truth. And that's hard for me to think about in light of hell. But He's spiritual, He's objective. Would you turn to Habakkuk? I don't know in my mind of a better place to have this discussion than Habakkuk. Habakkuk 1:13 says something in a verse you're probably familiar with, but it speaks to this discussion. I'll begin in verse 12. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You've appointed them for judgment, O Rock. You've marked them for correction. You're of purer eyes than to behold evil, and you cannot look on wickedness. Why do you look on those who deal treacherously and hold your tongue when the wicked devours a person more righteous than he? Habakkuk, the question that begins to struggle with and have is that Israel, over and over, they didn't listen to God. They would not respond. And what He's going to have to do is come and punish them with another nation. They will not listen. And so Habakkuk's struggling with this thought. You're going to use the Babylonians? Those wicked, awful, disgusting, hate mongers, rapers, murderers. You're going to use those people to teach us a lesson, God? And at the end of it, it still seems it's Habakkuk, and he's asking these questions about God, and he doesn't understand, yet he's praising Him. You're God. I'm man. We sang about it a moment ago, right? You're beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words. We stand in awe of God. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? You ever remember thinking, why did my mom or dad make that decision? Why did they do what they did? I don't really understand why that happened. And yet as you get a little bit older and you come a little bit further, you start to see, oh, that's why He had to do. I know that's a horrible illustration. It's so small and minute, but you think about that in family terms and you expand that to the world. The one who upholds everything by the word of His power. He holds all things. God, you know more than I know. You can see farther than I can see. And in light of all I know about God, everything Sam's been teaching us this whole quarter and this whole series of study, does that throw out everything else? This objective nature of God. He's spiritual. You're a spirit God, and those who worship Him must do so in spirit and in truth. When I think about hell, in light of God's love, I can do it easier when I consider that for a moment. Who can grasp your wisdom? But here's the fourth thing. Two more, real quick. I know I see fading. You're fading. This is a difficult subject and one that we like to tune out. It'd be easy to tune out. Jesus didn't tune out. He spoke about it often. He was warning individuals. Ezekiel 3, go read Ezekiel 3. Think about Ezekiel 3 in light of, hey, you who know better, if you don't warn them, if you don't open your mouth and save people Because I've given you the blessing to know. I've given you the gospel. If you don't open your mouth and tell people about the punishment and to save their souls from that, I'm going to hold you accountable. I'm going to hold you liable. We better start studying and understanding how to have a discussion about this if this book is true. And so as we think about that, hell in light of God's love, I also like to think about that He's not a capricious child. That's often the argument. When you think about hell, when you think about, I could never serve a God who would just gets mad at people and throws them in hell because they don't do what He says. And that's often what's given, and that's the idea that individuals hold in their mind about hell. Is that really what God does? But because you won't jump when He says jump, and right, and you won't just at His every whim do what He says to do, that He's going to take you and He's going to get mad and throw you in hell. That's not the God of heaven. That's not what hell is. The eternal destiny of each soul will, of course, be the choice of each soul. Ezekiel 33 and verse 11 makes it clear that God has no pleasure in the death of the wicked. He'd much rather they change their minds about the direction of their lives. Would you go to Romans chapter 2? Romans 2. I'm going to move closely. Would you also connect here Matthew 11? Read Matthew 11. It's going to fit in there, beginning in verse 20. Maybe you want to put it beside Romans 2. To me, it's relevant. But when you look at Romans chapter 2, it's interesting to think about this God that we serve, the one who created hell for the devil and his angels. Listen, He's not a capricious child. He talks about the plan that He has, but beginning there in chapter 2, verse 1, therefore you're inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things. But we know that the judgment of God is according to the truth against those who practice such things. And do you think this, O man, you who judge those practicing such things and doing the same, that you will escape the judgment of God? Do you despise the riches of His goodness, forbearance, and long-suffering, not knowing that the goodness of God leads you to repentance? But in accordance with the hardness of your impenitent heart, you're treasuring up for yourself wrath, and the day of wrath and revelation of righteous judgment of God. Did God just say that? Do you know who He's talking to? In chapter 1, the people that He was addressing would have been shaking their head. As you close chapter 1, he's got Gentiles in mind. He's got us in mind. Individuals that didn't have the oracles of God, who didn't grow up worshiping God, that never were connected in the way that they were to the God of heaven. He had a special, intimate relationship with them, and he begins to just rebuke. Paul is laying it to them. He's preaching straight to them. They're worthless, right? They're fools. They've left the knowledge of God. They're bound for hell. And they're shaking their head. But chapter 2, he turns and he basically gives the same message to the people that were just shaking their head, and you could see them, wait a minute. Not us. Not us. What do you mean we're storing up wrath? You're not responding to the goodness of God. Why does blessing come in the life of individuals? This isn't a capricious child getting mad. This is the God who from the very beginning has given chance after chance after chance after goodness, and He's calling, He's throwing His love, He's trying, He's calling over and over and over. Luke 15, for His people to come home, for them to turn. The forbearance. Oh, He's holding up that wrath. He doesn't want to put, would you just clothe yourself in the sacrifice that I've sent you? Would you bow to Christ? Would you follow Him? It could take it all away. He's been trying and trying and trying to call out to individuals, but they keep hardening their hearts. I can think about hell in the light of God's love, because it's not some split-second decision that God's going to send somebody there because of a mistake they make on a whim, and it's a direction of life. And it brings me to the next point as we think about the pain and the price and the progress of sin. When I think about the pain, the price, and the progress of sin, I can start to have a dialogue, and I can begin in my human mind, in my mind that likes to apologize for God. Have you ever done that? I don't want to talk about this. God, you would be a lot more attractive if we could talk about you this way. If we could lead with this doctrine, God, it would have been much better. Why do you have to have that discussion? And it's in the midst of His Word, and I like to apologize for God, and He's not asking me to do that. I can think about hell in light of God's love, the pain, the progress, the price of sin. Think about John 8 for a moment. John 8, and if you haven't read the Gospel of John, not getting to know who Jesus is, I would urge you to do that. It's easier to think about this teaching. It's easier to teach others about it when you've read that, you've discussed it. But in John 8 is a place that might be able to help you. In John 8, look especially in verse 42. Jesus said to them, "If God were your Father, you would love me. For I proceeded forth and I came from God, Nor have I come of myself, but He sent me. Why do you not understand my speech? Because you're not able to listen to my word. You are of your father, the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he does not stand in the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own sources, for he is a liar and the father of it." The creator of the first sin. The individual who brought death forth. And when Jesus talks about him in that way, have you ever thought about sin and you think, it's not really a big deal? You think about a lifestyle that stands opposed to what God has called us, to purity, right? Sacrifice, blessing other people. And you think, well, those who aren't really zealous, they're not really bad people. Do they really deserve what Jesus describes as hell? Does somebody like that really deserve? And when I think about the pain and the progression of sin, I can start to think, what's the worst sin you could ever commit? Is it slaughtering animals? Right? Like the environmentalists of our day, hurting animals or abusing children, or what's the worst sin what's the ones that are really worthy of hell that we don't have? Hitlers of the world. We don't mind talking about and having a discussion about what's the worst sin. And it's walking in the footsteps of the individual in John 8:44, turning your back on God, missing the mark. And to me, a place that spoke about it the best, and I'm going to leave you with this one in Psalm chapter 1, right? You think about the nasty progressive, right? Don't walk there. Go to Psalm 1. Because when I think about the progression, I think about what sin really is and what it really does to individuals, I can think about hell. I can think about hell in the light of a God who loves us. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful. And you see that, and perhaps you've heard a lesson on that many times, and you thought about the progression that happened. Don't walk in the counsel of the ungodly, because it's about a progression. Which way are you headed? Why is it that every time Paul begins to talk about the Christian life, he talks about it as a walk? You used to walk as the Gentiles, but you don't walk that way anymore. Now you walk with God. You're in a new direction with your life. You've been killed your own pleasures and your own passions. You've died to self. You live for Him. It's a walk, and because what happens when we turn our back on God, that sin, the smallest one or the biggest one, and begin to think, hey, that's okay. When we walk in the counsel of the ungodly, we'll stand in the path of sinners. When we stand in the path of sinners, we'll sit down in the seat of the scornful. At some point, you'll wake up. It's not so bad. And you'll start thinking with the rest of them, it's no big deal. It's just a little sin. It's just a little thing. The pain and the progression of sin, and we could go a lot of places. If I hadn't wearied so many of you out, we could talk about that in depth. Would you think about there's no little one, that God came and he sent his son to save us from even the smallest. Hell is not a place where God takes and tortures the people that are not like me. Hell is the eternal reality of the soul for those that decides not to be like God. Not for the people that don't look like me. And too many times when we have the discussion about hell, that's how we talk about it. The ones that don't look like me and act like me and talk like me. You stop comparing ourselves to ourselves and start looking at our great God. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his beautiful face. Because when I look in the light of hell, when I look at hell in the light of God's love and I see Christ, it's easier. I can begin to do it. I hope you'll do it. Listen, Jesus went about, he came to the world to save individuals from that. It was a place that was created for the devil and his angels, not souls created in his image. Not for you and not for me, and we need to be warning individuals about it. We could have talked about 5 other things, and maybe they would have made more sense. But would you begin talking about something? Would you begin talking about digging in and looking at what God says about this really horrific subject? This eternal reality for individuals. He didn't want it to be so. And so he sent his son. If you haven't responded to his love, if you haven't responded to the gospel invitation, the good news that Jesus came and he died for you, turning from the decisions you've been making, the life that you've been living, the walk that you're on, to start walking towards him, confessing Jesus today and every day, right? Being baptized, right? Buried as Christ was, raised to walk in newness of life. You can do that today on your way to heaven. What's the definition of success? Living my life so that I go to heaven. And it's utter failure if I live my life that I go to hell. And there's no excuse. I hope we'll begin studying it, understanding it, and talking about it in a way that's God-honoring. If there's anybody who needs to respond, you'd like help studying this subject, you'd like help studying any other subject, that we could open God's Word with you, we'd love to do that as together we stand and as we sing.